I apologise, I'm sitting in bed. I'm actually hiding from my 5-year-old who has decided that she wants to tell me all the things this afternoon. So if we suddenly get into an interruption, I'll try and ward her off. But just be aware of that. So I want to talk to you about a treatise of Portuguese cooking from the 15th century. There's a wonderful Portuguese title there, and my Portuguese is pretty horrific, especially my pronunciation, so I'm not going to read that, but I leave that for you. Shinjo, if there are any questions, are you muted? You're
No, I'm not
unmuted.
muted. Can
Cool,
you hear me?
that's fine. Yeah, I can hear you. If there are questions on the chat, do you want to just interrupt me? I'm quite happy for that.
Okay.
Cool. The book itself, I spent a lot. I came across this book initially via the Medieval Cookery website, which a lot of you will probably be familiar with. It's the website where you've got all the different types of cookbooks, and I wanted something Portuguese to fit in with my Portuguese persona, and this popped up, and I'm like, "Ooh, this is exciting!" It is the only Portuguese cookbook from period that I am aware of. Which in terms of me developing a Portuguese persona is really exciting. Back to my presentation there. And the more I researched, though, the more I found out of all these conflicting names for it. I found that there was the Treatise of Portuguese Cooking in the 15th century. I found there was the cookbook of Infanta Maria of Portugal. And I'm just like, but are these the same ones, or are they different, or I don't know. And what I found out is that they are actually the same book. That what happened in the 1960s is that there were two versions published of them. One, the 1963 version, was given the title Tratado da Cuisine, while the 1967 one had the Maria of Portugal added to it. The 63 version is the one that is translated on the Medieval Cookery website, and the original version of it is on the Cervantes visual link just below there. This has about 60 of the cooking recipes only. One thing to be aware of is that whoever wrote them in the 1960s updated parts of them to include quantities, which you don't often find in period recipes. A lot of you'll be very familiar as you read through period recipes. You'll see instructions like "till it be enough," which is one of my absolute favourite period recipe instructions, or "smite them," which is also another one of my very favourite Tudor instructions. So reading through this and seeing all of a sudden 500 grams of something, I'm like, that doesn't quite compute. And finding out that that these recipes had been updated in the 1960s to include these recipes made a lot more sense. The 1967 version contains recipes for beauty products as well. Now, I haven't managed to find a version of that in Portuguese or in English, tragically. I hope to do so one day. Are there any questions at this stage? We're all good?
Yes, we're all good.
Cool. There's also a 1986 version of this. I don't know what's in it. I've seen the cover online, but that's it. It is a fairly obscure period cookbook, which is a shame. Who was this Dona Infanta Maria? And I'm not sure if you can actually see that. This is Dona Infanta Maria here. Isn't she quite? It is quite a beautiful picture of her. It's painted by Antonius Moore, and what we know about Maria is that she married Alexander Farnese in 1565, and it is thought that she took this book with her from Portugal to Italy, and this is how the book ended up. The manuscript ended up in Naples. There's no title on the manuscript. It's just a collection of recipes. We know they're Portuguese because they're written in Portuguese. Everything I have read suggests it's in the National Museum in Naples. But the problem with this is I went through the catalogue of it when I was doing preparation for this class and could not find any reference of it there. So I don't know if it's not in Naples any longer, or due to Italian bureaucracy it's disappeared somewhere. A bit frustrating, actually. In terms of Portuguese culinary history, it's so important because there are no earlier Portuguese cookbooks in this. So this is it for until there's another one much later in the 17th century. But for period SCA cooking, this is what we've got, and that's it. And it's kind of sad that it seems to have vanished. The most important thing, I think, for me in terms of with my interest in period cooking, is that the school of thought, and I'm just waving this book around. If you haven't seen this is wonderful. It's called At the First Table: Food and Social Identity in Early Modern Spain. Jodie Campbell, who wrote this book, actually does talk briefly about this Portuguese cookbook. And the point she makes about it is that this cookbook was written by women. And this is based on the handwriting. It's also that part of that link to Dona Maria as well. There are definitely at least two different types of handwriting in the book. And in one of the recipes, it mentions Brazil, which is a particular type of wine that's drunk in Brazil, which would therefore date those particular recipes to the sort of first half of the 16th century, when Portugal had gone and started to colonize Brazil. What I can just imagine is a collection of women sitting down, and someone writes out their recipe book and then passes it on to their daughter, who then adds bits into it, and it stays on as one of those family recipe books. And this, to me, makes this particular book so exciting, because it is far more focused on domestic cookery and a woman's role in cooking than a lot of your other period cookbooks, which are often written by men, and they're written by men cooking in high status kitchens. So it's quite a different world and a different sort of culinary experience to what you get here. There are a couple of recipes which are recipes with women's names attached to them, like the tartlets of Dona Isabella de Vilhena, and the marmalade, my particular favourite, of Dona Joana, which of course for me is quite exciting. I will have to make that one day when I find some quinces. And you can imagine a couple of women get around and go, "Oh, Joana, you've got the most wonderful recipe for marmalade. Could I please have a copy of it? Oh, Isabella, great tartlets you cooked the other week. Could I grab your recipe of it and writing it down?" I think all of you may have recipes at home which are like this for you, that you've got off someone. My husband and I have a chocolate brownie recipe that I actually got off one of my ex-students, which is lived on as Nikhil's brownie recipe, and that's how we refer to it now. Oh, you're going to cook Nikhil's brownie recipe. It's a fabulous brownie recipe as well. But this is exactly the same sort of thing in the 15th, 16th century. And that, to me, it just makes it seem so much more human, which is really kind of cool. Any questions at this stage?
No, we're good.
Cool. Here is one. This is not a Wikimedia Commons one. It's not. A little bit worried about the copyright of it, but this is an image I managed to find of the original recipes, and you can see the quite round, sort of loopy Gothic handwriting in there. So what we've got is a cookbook written by a woman for a woman, and then passed down through families. A very domestic item. There are 4 sections of the cookbook that we have, or in particular the ones we have translated into English. There's a meat section, an egg section, a milk section, and a preserve section. So there are 60 recipes. Now, you can see here I've got some lovely little numbers. And what I did is I went through the recipe books and looked at how many recipes featured various ingredients. And so what you'll see there, where you see the 9 out of 60, that means that 9 of those recipes out of the 60 feature chicken, or 4 include mutton. Chicken seems to be the most common main meat. You don't necessarily get a lot of much, or you get a little bit of beef, a little bit of lamb, a few recipes for rabbit, and a few odd ones like there's a partridge recipe and a pigeon recipe and a lamprey recipe. There is, if you can see there, the numbers for pork and bacon are quite high, but often it's used as a sort of secondary ingredient in, say, a chicken dish, including the one I'm going to cook later. So you might use your bacon fat or your pork fat as a way of providing grease in your dish, or adding fat content into a sauce that you're making would often come from that pork fat. A method or a reference to tocino, which is like a pork fat. I've used lardo from our Italian grocer here to do something very similar to that. There are also a couple of marrow dishes. Now, I was very blonde, which sounds very insulting. I was not very smart when I read that, and I'm like, oh, marrow, like a giant courgette. It's not a giant courgette, and what they mean is bone marrow. So I started to think about, they're like, oh, they're actually in the meat section. So they are. So you get a couple of marrow dishes where they've extracted the marrow from the bones and then cooked them with various things. I really want to try them at some stage. Interestingly, and if you think about modern Portuguese cooking, it is very much based around seafood. You get lots of sardines as one of those classic Portuguese dishes, and the other one is salt cod. And they catch their cod sort of off the coast of the New World and bring it back and salt it. Now we're doing this in period as well. But in this cookbook, there are not a lot of, there's like one recipe for a water-dwelling creature, which is the lamprey. There's no fish dishes in there, which I found surprising. And a couple of people who've commented on it suggest that fish was very much a poor dish. So if you were poor, you ate fish. The rich didn't eat fish in such a way because it was seen as being kind of a bit beneath them. However, that doesn't necessarily compute with me if you think about Portugal being a Catholic society where they would usually eat not meat on a Friday. You'd have your fasting days where the Lenten season as well, where you wouldn't eat fish. Possibly it just means that there weren't any fish recipes in this collection. It could mean that people already knew the fish recipes because they cooked them so much and therefore didn't need to write them down. I am really surmising here. It is very much, I don't know, but there aren't fish recipes in here, which is somewhat surprising. Questions at this stage?
I think we're good.
Cool. There are, however, a lot of eggs. 24 out of 60 recipes include eggs of some description. Sometimes they're used as thickeners in sauces, and you'll put egg yolks in to kind of add a bit more bulk to a sauce. Sometimes, and it's quite cool in some of the sugar dishes, what you'll do is you'll put like a raft of beaten egg whites on top of the sugar to clarify it and make your sugar a lot sort of whiter and a lot clearer. There are also quite a lot of egg and sugar dishes as well. So whether those were used as partly as Lenten dishes too, that could be a reason for the lack of fish dishes. Lots of egg and sugar dishes. And sugar was the most common ingredient across all the recipes. There were 45 dishes that included sugar, which to me says for some fairly rotten Portuguese teeth in the 15th and 16th century. Often you get it used with cinnamon, and that, your modern donuts where you get the cinnamon and the sugar sort of crust. Often you'll see this in Portuguese dishes with meat dishes, that the final instruction will be to put sugar and cinnamon over the top as a kind of as a seasoning over the top. A lot of the egg dishes have sugar as part of it, and then you've got all the preserving dishes, which seem to be very much part of, for women, I'd imagine as well, part of their cooking experiences, that they're going and they're preserving fruit for future use. I was quite interested in what spices they used, particularly with the way that Portugal was in the sort of the start of the 16th century, where you're getting a lot of spices coming into Portugal from their colonies in India in particular, and that spice route ended up being kind of circumvented to come through Portugal rather than going through Venice as it traditionally had done in the early 16th century. And so the spices were coming in from Malacca and from what we think of now as sort of Indonesia, Malaysia, coming to Goa and India, and then going to Portugal from there. Again, interesting the type of spices that they used. Cinnamon's the big one, and again, that's partly because it was used as a dressing. Then cloves. Cloves, particularly for spicing meat dishes, were very much used. You often get a sort of combination of clove and black pepper, sometimes ginger, and quite often saffron as well. Those seem to be for Portuguese cooking the big sort of combination. The key spice combination was cloves, saffron, pepper, ginger. Aniseed anise is used in two recipes, and cumin and only in one. And there's this lovely quote I found in one of the books I was reading, actually Ray Tannehill's book on a history of food, where she talks about a German decree from 1523 that commented sourly on over 100 tons of ginger and almost 200 tons of pepper had come into Germany from Lisbon along, and the King of Portugal, with spices under his control, has set prices as he will, is showing the Portuguese dominance over the spice route in the early 16th century. If you just pause for a minute and think how much 100 tons of ginger would be, how huge quantities of ginger were coming into Europe at that point in time, and how wealthy the Portuguese must have got off it. Any questions at this stage?
No.
We're all good? Very quiet. Herbs, commonest herbs are cilantro or coriander, parsley and mint. Onions are used quite often. There's about 6 dishes that used onions out of the 60, and they specifically mention green onion in a couple. There is a mention of a herb called cheiro verde, which in Portuguese literally translates to green smell, which is particularly helpful. Fernanda Gomez, who did the translation on the medieval cookery site, is not sure what this is, and she has a lot more experience in Portuguese cooking than I actually do. I've used parsley in these dishes, and when I went and did a Google search of that particular word, I noticed it often was translated in Portuguese recipes as either parsley or coriander, which would very much fit in with what we're seeing here in terms of their sort of common herbs. You do get, though, that sour element into some meat dishes, which is very much part of period cooking. More often lemon juice. There's only one mention I found of verjuice, which again I found interesting because being quite used to sort of French or English cooking, you see a lot of verjuice. Quite a bit of vinegar. It was six vinegar out of them all. And you get some pine nuts and some almonds used in both sweet and in meat dishes, which again, very much part of period or medieval cooking or like Renaissance cooking. They talk about the use of flour water. Now, not particularly helpfully specific. Often it's used as a seasoning at the end, particularly on some of those sugar dishes, or they'll be the sugar will be rendered in some way with the flour water as part of making a sweet dish. I think if I was cooking that, I'd probably use the orange blossom water you can get in a lot of Middle Eastern grocers to give the effects of it. It certainly does talk about orange flour as specifically as opposed to just flour water. I think I would be a little hesitant about using rose water just because the flavor, the smell in that is quite strong. I think you're going to get more the subtle hint to what they're indicating here with the orange flour water or something like that. I really want to try the recipe where they basically go from getting orange blossoms to turning them into sweets, and they work with them all the way down to get the flavouring out of the flowers before turning them into a sweet. It's quite cool. You also get mentions of rice. Only one recipe using cheese that I find interesting, which is a soft cheese used in a tart. 2 for honey. I think probably the predominance of sugar meant that there was probably less honey being used as a sweetener. Milk's used quite a lot. There are about 5. There's a whole milk section with 5 dishes in it. And one thing I found interesting, I'll talk about later, is when you think about what we take as Portuguese cooking these days, with that idea of the Portuguese custard tart, which is the thing that you eat when you're in Lisbon. There's actually a recipe in this book for what is basically a custard tart, which I thought was really cool, and I really enjoy it. I cooked that for a dinner a while ago, and it didn't taste too far off what the Portuguese tarts I've actually tried over time. One thing you don't see a lot of is vegetables. Again, possibly like the fish dishes, it was almost an assumed everyone knew how to cook those, so we're just not going to write them down, or basic, so why bother writing them down? Or possibly not cooked all that much. Again, you get that sort of, I guess, upper class reluctance to cook vegetables or to eat vegetables, seeing them as being a bit poor. You get lettuce stalks, I found interesting, used candied and used in a sweet dish in one of the recipes in here. And there's also a sweet pumpkin compote as well. Now, what sort of pumpkin they were using there, not entirely sure. Interested to find out. And then you get into your fruit preserving section. Now, our word marmalade, of course, comes from the Portuguese word mamalo, which is quince. And that is very kind of obvious here in the references to quinces within the preserving section, that there's 5 quince recipes and 1 quince with meat recipe. It seems to be a fairly fundamental part of Portuguese cooking at this point in time. And you can imagine when you get those quince preserves, it's coming into places like England, and they'll go, what's this? And the Portuguese people will go, it's a marmelo, it's a quince. And they'll go, marmalade, excellent, what a lovely word. And you get Paddington Bear being the quintessentially English bear with his orange marmalade. And probably in English cuisine, they started to use other things like oranges. It seemed a bit more exotic, and came up with the English idea of your bitter marmalades. Citrons are used, a couple of peaches, and a few pear recipes. No apple recipes. And one thing I found fascinating was that butter was the most common fat used. Only 5 of olive oil, but 17 instances of butter. And I do think that's in part due, there are quite a lot of sweet dishes in there, and I think butter worked better in those. But again, you think of Mediterranean cuisine being focused around olive oil. Not a lot of olive oil mentioned in here. Just interesting. If you were at my Portuguese dress class earlier, you heard me probably talk about this. It's one of my absolute favourite images at the moment. It's from a 1540s codice of the Portuguese in their sort of colonial territories. So in India, and some images of them in Japan as well in the book. This particular one is from Hormuz, and it is these Portuguese merchants, upper class, sitting in this pool of water to keep them cool while they're dining. Which I feel very sorry for those poor chairs, which probably wouldn't survive the experience all that well. But it's just interesting seeing Portuguese people eating in this sort of setting. Some of the examples of recipes from this book, you've got meat pastries, which are very much like the meat pies that you think of being period. The spice mix, the use of mince, any type of minced meat, and you think about these sort of origins of the Christmas mince pies, kind of like that. However, not a lot of fruit. And again, thinking about English and French cuisine, where you get a lot of fruit cooked with meat, you don't see a lot of that in the Portuguese one. You've got the quince and meat dish, but doesn't seem to be particularly common otherwise. Moorish chicken I will talk about, because that's the recipe I cooked and will hopefully watch a video of later. There are 2 different recipes for Moorish chicken in there, and again, this sort of harks back to that history of Portugal in the sort of early part of I guess period where you have the Moors in residence in Portugal, and those food traditions of the spiced meat can very much come into this sort of Portuguese cuisine at this point in time. Personally, this beef mince recipe is actually one of my favourite ones. My husband's family has this recipe for mince on toast, which is kind of like the ultimate comfort food on life's not going well. You have to cook something for dinner in a hurry. Mince is cheap, add some seasoning to it, cook it on toast. This is basically the 15th or 16th century Portuguese equivalent of that. It is mince served on bread, and the mince is flavoured with some of the spice combinations we've talked about with your cloves, and it is absolutely delicious. It's got a good bit of vinegar in it, so it's got a bit of tartness to it. So the tart, the spices, and the mince, it makes for a really nice kind of comfort food. The lacy eggs I want to try. I initially thought it would be like an omelette type thing with lacy egg patterns, but what it actually is you beat up your egg whites to be quite stiff with some sugar, and then you pipe them into melted butter in the shape of like shoe bows, is what they mean by lacy eggs here. So you get little laces made out of the sort of meringue type fabric. The white dish is a blanc-mange. So what you'd see is in French and English cuisine in this period has been that idea of being the blanc-mange with the rice and the chicken. That white dish is exactly the same. There's the custard tart I was talking about. So Portuguese custard tart, actually Portuguese custard tart. The compotes, of which there's quite a lot. The marmalade of Dona Joana is a quince marmalade. So that idea of the marmello for quince. And there's also a recipe for comfits as well, which are like those sweets that you'd have at the end of the meat, which are of the end of a meal, which is like a small candy. I might pause here in case there are any questions, because I've done a lot of talking.
There aren't any at the moment.
Cool. Comments? We're all good?
Yeah, we're all good.
All good? Awesome. All right. So this particular recipe is one of my favourites. This is probably the first time I cooked out of this cookbook, and I served it for a friend of mine for dinner, actually. Mistress Isabel Marie, if you're in the previous class, had some one of my earlier versions of this. And it's cooking a chicken in spices and in the herbs in the sort of Moorish fashion. I've provided the literal translation there from Medieval Cookery, and this is my redaction of it. I think what we might do, if we possibly can, is play the video, which means I will need to make you host.
We have one question.
Excellent.
Bacon in a Moorish recipe?
Yes, the bacon in the Moorish recipe. I comment on this in the video. I think it's just the Christian Portuguese going, oh, we like the idea of this. How can we make it better? Let's add bacon. So would it be something that the Moors would actually cook? Probably not. Is it something that is potentially inspired by Moorish cooking? Absolutely. But I think people have kind of the Portuguese have put their own wee spin on it. Greetings! This is how to make another form of Moorish chicken from the Portuguese cookbook of the 15th and 16th century, which we have just discussed. As you'll see here on the bench, I have a lovely array of ingredients here. I feel a little bit like I'm about to enter into a reality cooking show. We have got some chicken thigh cutlets. I like using these in this particular dish because the bit of bone means that they keep their shape. The thigh is a wee bit more flavourful, and they're actually reasonably cheap as well. And I think if I was making this in bulk for, say, a feast, I'd probably use those as a good labour-saving device as well. I've got some bacon, which is mostly for the fat content, and I've made sure it's quite a thick sliced one as well, so I will hunk that up in a moment and chop that up to put it in the sauce. We have got a good large size onion, as specified in the recipe. We have our selection of herbs. We've got some Italian parsley, some coriander, and some mint. My herb garden's a bit on the fritz at the moment, so I've had to buy those. I've also got stock, and this is one of my kind of variations from the original, and that says it's to use water. I find if you're using chicken stock, it just has a wee bit more flavour. And then we have got our spices. We've got cloves, we've got ginger, we've got some lovely saffron, and we have got pepper. And we've got some salt. And we have got a bit of white wine vinegar. And to serve, we have a loaf of lovely supermarket ciabatta, which I find is a nice shape and a nice texture. And you put it underneath your chicken and it soaks up the juices quite beautifully. I've now chopped up all the ingredients, including the onion. You did not want to see me cutting up onions. It's the one thing that makes me cry, and I forgot to put that one in the fridge, which usually works. I've also chopped up the herbs. with my very handy pair of kitchen scissors, which I find helps get them into a reasonable size. Quantities of the herbs. I've put on there, the ingredients says quite a bit of coriander, a little less of parsley, and a few leaves of mint. So I've kind of tried to go with that, with the 1/4 cup of coriander, about a tablespoon of parsley, and a few leaves of mint. It's not hard and fast though, and you can put what suits you depending on how much leafage your plants have got and how you're feeling on the day, really. I am now heating up the oil. I use my cast iron Dutch oven to do this. I find this a really good tool to cook this particular dish in. You can cook it all on the stove. It's got plenty of good heat on it, and it just works wonders. And then once I have heated up the oil, I put in my bacon. And then let that cook for a bit. Now I'm browning off the bacon, and now, as you can see in my pot there, getting quite brown and a bit crispy. And then I'm going to put the chicken in and just brown that off a little bit with the bacon. Give it a bit of colour, a bit more flavour. I just give that a few minutes on either side. Variation I'm going to make from the recipe I've written up this time is I'm actually going to take the chicken and the bacon out of the pot. The reason for that being is that they're browning up quite nicely, and I want to cook the onion down a wee bit. So you won't be able to get all of the bacon out, but as much as you possibly can, because otherwise it will go a little bit too far and not be very pleasant. It's not what you want, because this is a delicious dish. And then putting in the onion, the herbs, and a wee bit of salt. And just letting that cook down a little bit. This is cooking down quite nicely now, and the herbs have the most delicious aroma as they cook off. It's just lovely, particularly the coriander really gives it a lovely smell. I mean, if you think about this dish, the idea of this is it sort of comes from that Moorish heritage of Portugal, where in the Moorish idea of cooking with lots of different herbs and spices, however no bacon, which is probably where we get the Christian Portuguese coming into this particular dish. And then I've just popped the chicken and the bacon back in, and we'll just cook that down a little bit longer. I've now cooked off the onion and the chicken for around about 10 minutes, just with stirring it and keeping a bit of a close eye on it so it doesn't stick. So what I am now going to do is what I think they technically call deglaze the pan, but also I put a wee bit of stock in, and I've just pushed off all the brown bits off the bottom. And I'm now going to add around about 2 cups worth of stock. Again, have a look to see where your chicken is sitting. If you don't want to put too much in, but you also don't want to be too stingy. So that's a 1 litre carton, and I put basically 2 cups worth in, and I'm just going to prod my chicken down into that. So, as I said before, I use the stock for the flavour. It just makes it a little bit more delicious, particularly if you're using chicken breasts or an unboned type of chicken, which is not going to have as much flavour. Now we've got the stock up to a boil, we will add in our spices, which is the ginger, the clove, and the pepper. I've got my nice handy mortar and pestle here. All very typical Portuguese spices from that cookbook. Cloves in particular seem to be very well used. Add in a pinch, nice wee tub of saffron here, a small pinch of saffron, and a tablespoon of our white wine vinegar, which just adds a little bit of a kick to it. It really helps develop the flavour of this dish. This has been simmering for about 5 minutes now, at around about a mid sort of heat. And I am now going to use my next bit of kitchen wizardry, which is a total cheat, and I am separating the eggs with my handy egg separator. You need 4 yolks for this, and this helps to thicken up the sauce. What I will do is, once I have separated them, I will show you what I do when I put them in, because this is the kind of the trick of this dish. So I now have my egg yolks in a glass, and I'm just giving them a bit of a stir with a fork to mix them up a wee bit, and then I am going to pour them into my stock and my chicken. The important part of this is to try and do that so it doesn't turn into scrambled eggs, because if you do this, if you don't get this right, you end up with basically a floaty layer of scrambled eggs on the top of this, and it is not pleasant. So what you need to do when you pour it in is to pour it in quickly and then mix it really hard. So I'm going to go for it. So you're mixing those egg yolks into your sauce as firmly as possible, so you don't get unpleasantness. It's actually turned out quite well. You can see there it's a lot kind of creamier in texture. Try to avoid getting any of the whites in, because they just turn into white strings, which are really not pleasant to eat either. And here we have got our final version with some coriander as a garnish and the chicken on top of the bread in the bowl. And family is about to have dinner. I do like having the bread underneath. It just soaks up the sauce really nicely, so it doesn't feel like it's going to waste.
Oh, here's one question. Was it, why didn't you temper the eggs?
I could have tempered the eggs. It doesn't specify that in the recipe, but up to you. I haven't found I needed to do so. I found that just really, really good stir through. You get it stirring through rather than which it does what it needs to do, which is providing that bit of thickness to it. Chicken thighs are quite good to use, either boned or boneless, because they've got a little bit more flavour than your chicken breasts. And I just think if you put a chicken breast in and you cook it for that long, it can dry out and it's not very nice. So yeah, that was the final product there. So we had a suggestion of setting the table nicely. So we've got some beautiful period wine glasses I bought in York, actually, along with the dish. Fancy it up a wee bit. It's a really, really nice dish, and not too difficult to make, actually. And it's always a good sort of, it always sort of goes down quite well. Thank you. Any other questions or thoughts about this? I'm going to put up a link to my PowerPoints up onto my website, and I will post the link to the website in the Collegio Facebook page, so you can see that there. If anyone comes across anything else Portuguese-wide in terms of food, please don't hesitate to drop me a message. I love talking about this, and I want to know more. As I was sort of saying in the other class, I'm sort of at the start on my journey into discovering more about 16th century Portugal, and really appreciate any other resources people come across, because I find it fascinating. And yeah, I finished a wee bit early. I haven't done the oranges of the Portuguese fashion from Hupla. I must do so. So there's another English recipe called farts of Portugal, which I love the name of, which is basically like a meatball and sauce. And there's a recipe. There's actually a recipe for something called farts in this particular cookbook, but they're actually more of a sweet dish than the savoury. There is a recipe for what are called hazelnuts in this cookbook, which is actually quite similar to the idea of the English farts recipe, which is a meatball that is cooked in a broth. Which is but the English version has added fruit to it, which is not, of course, using what you see in the Portuguese. Yeah, farts of Portugal are great. They're always delicious. Yes, we do have access to bitter oranges at the moment, which is quite exciting. I feel some preserving coming on. Oh, cool. The information about your is good. Thank you. I would love to compare the different translations. It does involve me getting my hands on an actual copy of the 1968 book, which I priced up recently. I found a version that was $200 US. So I'd love to buy it at some stage, but not at the moment. I'd love to get a copy of all three actually and see if there are any differences in the versions. There's only one real English translation of this particular one. There is a translation into Japanese, which is not very helpful. Oh, well, thank you all for coming and allowing me to geek out about Portuguese food for 45 minutes. I really enjoyed that.